The lecture hall fell silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom or distraction, but the heavy electric quiet that precedes something extraordinary. 57 people sat in wooden chairs, their eyes fixed on a man who had just asked them to do something that would challenge everything they believed about the nature of reality itself. The year was 1953, and what happened in that room over the next 10 minutes would prove that the invisible forces of imagination are far more powerful than the visible world of facts and circumstances. The man speaking possessed an unusual quality. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture dramatically, did not employ the theatrical tricks so common among those who claim to reveal life's mysteries. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had tested his theories not in the realm of speculation, but in the laboratory of lived experience. His words carried the weight of conviction that comes only from knowing, not merely believing. The instruction was deceptively simple. Each person was to imagine themselves climbing a ladder, not to visualize it casually or think about it abstractly, but to feel themselves doing it, to experience the sensation of their hands gripping the rungs, their feet finding purchase, their body moving upward step by step. They were to make it real in their imagination, as real as any physical act they had ever performed. The room grew even quieter as minds began to work, as inner worlds came alive with the experience of climbing. But then came the contradiction that would make this experiment legendary. After having them feel the reality of climbing a ladder in their imagination, the instructor did something that seemed to guarantee failure. He told them explicitly, emphatically, that they would not climb a ladder. Not today, not tomorrow, not in the coming week. In no circumstances would any of them find themselves climbing an actual physical ladder. The contradiction was deliberate and complete. On one side, the feeling of having climbed, impressed upon consciousness through the act of assuming it real. On the other side, a direct command to the conscious mind that such an event would not occur. It was as if two opposing forces had been set in motion within each person present. Which would prove stronger, the feeling impressed upon imagination, or the logical instruction given to the rational mind? What happened next defied every conventional understanding of how the world works. Within days, every single person who had participated in this simple exercise found themselves climbing a ladder, not because they sought out the opportunity, but because circumstances arranged themselves to make it inevitable. Ladders appeared in their paths as if summoned by some invisible hand. Emergency situations arose requiring their use. Work assignments materialized that demanded climbing. Coincidences multiplied beyond the realm of statistical possibility. The man who conducted this experiment understood something that modern thinking has forgotten. The ultimate purpose of understanding imagination's creative power extends beyond achieving personal desires. It leads to the recognition that consciousness itself is the foundation of all experience, that individual awareness is not separate from universal consciousness, but is universal consciousness individualized. This recognition transforms not only what is experienced, but the very sense of who is doing the experiencing. When you truly understand that imagination commands matter through assumption, you discover that you are not a small, separate being struggling against powerful external forces. You are consciousness itself, the very power through which your world comes into being. This is not merely a comforting belief, but a practical reality that can be tested and proven through the application of these principles. The ladder experiment provides a perfect metaphor for this ultimate realization. Every desire, every aspiration, every dream of transformation is a ladder waiting to be climbed. But the climbing does not happen in the external world first. It happens in consciousness through assumption. You climb first in imagination, feeling yourself to be what you desire to be, and this inner climbing creates the outer ladder. Your entire life is your ladder experiment. Every day, through countless assumptions maintained with feeling, you are proving that consciousness creates reality. The question is not whether this principle works, but whether you will work with it consciously or remain unconscious of your creative power. The choice stands before you with absolute clarity. You can continue to assume yourself limited by circumstances, bound by the past, subject to forces beyond your control. These assumptions will continue to create experiences that validate them, proving to your satisfaction that you are indeed powerless. Or you can begin to assume the truth of your being, that you are consciousness itself, unlimited and creative, capable of transforming any condition through the simple but profound act of feeling yourself to be what you desire to be. The ladder is always there. Consciousness is always creating. The only question is what you will choose to assume, and therefore what you will choose to experience. In this moment, with this understanding, you have everything you need to begin climbing toward any destiny you can imagine and feel as real. Your imagination is not merely a faculty you possess. It is the creative power of the universe expressing itself as you. Use it consciously and watch your world transform to match your grandest assumptions about what is possible for your life. He knew that consciousness is not a passive observer of reality, but the very foundation from which reality emerges. He had discovered through years of testing and proving that assumption, though false to the outer senses, hardens into fact when felt as true within imagination. The ladder experiment was not a parlor trick or a curious coincidence. It was scientific proof of the most fundamental principle governing human experience. This man had not always possessed such knowledge. He began life in circumstances that would suggest no special destiny, no unusual gifts, no indication that he would one day challenge the very foundations of how human beings understand their relationship to the world around them. Born on a small island where the boundaries between the mystical and the practical had never been clearly drawn, he learned early that reality was far more fluid than most people believed. His journey toward understanding began not in lecture halls or libraries, but in the theater. As a young man seeking his fortune, he discovered that the art of assuming a character could extend far beyond the stage. When he took on a role, something mysterious happened. He did not merely pretend to be someone else, he became someone else. The transformation was so complete that it affected not only his behavior and speech, but the very circumstances of his life. This discovery led him to a teacher whose methods were as unconventional as they were effective. Under this guidance, he learned that the human imagination is not a faculty for entertainment or escapism, but the creative power of the universe itself operating through individual consciousness. He learned that every person walks through life unconsciously assuming themselves to be this or that. And these assumptions, however false they may appear to the outer world, inevitably externalize as experience. The teacher showed how, in that the stories humanity has told itself for thousands of years are not historical accounts of external events, but psychological dramas describing the relationship between consciousness and its creations. Every myth, every religious narrative, every tale of transformation speaks to the same fundamental truth. What is imagined and felt as real becomes real in experience. Years of testing followed, not the comfortable testing of theories in academic settings, but the rigorous proving that comes from staking one's entire life on a principle. He learned to assume states of consciousness that corresponded to desires unfulfilled in his outer circumstances. He learned to feel himself to be what he wanted to be, to live from the end of every wish, to make real in imagination what was not yet real in fact. The results were undeniable. Assumptions became facts. Inner states externalized as outer conditions. The feeling of being what he wanted to be preceded and created the circumstances that made it so. Through this practice, he discovered that human beings are not victims of circumstance, but unconscious creators of everything they experience. This understanding transformed not only his own life, but his entire purpose. He realized that the greatest service he could render was to share this knowledge, to prove to others that they possessed the same creative power that had transformed his circumstances. The ladder experiment became one of many demonstrations he would offer to prove that imagination, when properly directed, is the master of reality. The setup for the ladder experiment was carefully designed to eliminate every possible explanation except the one that mattered. The participants were ordinary people leading ordinary lives. They had no particular spiritual training, no special preparation, no reason to expect anything unusual to occur. They were simply asked to engage their imagination in a specific way and then told explicitly that what they had imagined would not happen. The room itself contributed to the effectiveness of the experiment. Free from distractions, it allowed complete focus on the inner work of assuming. The participants closed their eyes and began the process of making real in consciousness what was not yet real in the physical world. They were instructed to feel their hands gripping the rungs of a ladder, to sense the slight roughness of the wood or the coolness of metal against their palms. Each person was guided to experience the physical sensations of climbing. The slight strain in their leg muscles as they lifted their weight. The shift in balance as they moved from one rung to the next. The view changing as they ascended, the ground growing more distant below them. They were told to make it completely real, to live it fully in their imagination until there was no difference between the imagined act and a physical one. The key was not visualization in the sense of merely seeing pictures in the mind, but embodiment. They were to assume the consciousness of someone who had just climbed a ladder. They were to feel themselves to be the kind of person to what? Climbing ladders was a natural, normal occurrence. They were to take on the state of consciousness that would make such an event inevitable. The instructor moved through the room as this inner work proceeded, his voice calm and steady, guiding the experience deeper. He understood that consciousness is the only reality, and that everything experienced in the outer world is simply consciousness pushed out into objectification. The ladder they were climbing in imagination was as real as any ladder they had ever encountered, because reality is consciousness, and consciousness was fully engaged in the act of climbing. When the inner experience felt complete, when each person had fully assumed the state of having climbed, the instruction was given to open their eyes and return attention to the outer room. But the work was done, the assumption had been made, the state had been entered and impressed upon consciousness. What remained was simply the inevitable externalization of what had been established within. Then came the moment that made this demonstration so powerful. With the same calm authority with which he had guided the imaginative experience, the instructor told them directly that they would not climb a ladder. The contradiction was stark and intentional. Their conscious minds now held a clear prohibition against the very thing they had just experienced as accomplished fact in imagination. This created the perfect test of which force truly governs human experience. Would the rational mind with its logical prohibitions prove stronger, or would consciousness respond to what had been assumed and felt as real? The answer would come not through argument or debate, but through the undeniable evidence of lived experience in the days that followed. The reports began arriving within 48 hours. A telephone call here, a letter there, each one describing the same impossible pattern. Mrs. Henderson found herself climbing the fire escape of her apartment building when the elevator broke down and her elderly neighbor needed help reaching the 4th floor. Mr. Williams discovered that his new job assignment required him to inspect warehouse inventory stored on high shelves, necessitating the use of a tall ladder that had been waiting for him as if by appointment. The accounts multiplied with mechanical precision. Every single participant, without exception, encountered circumstances that required them to climb a ladder. Not metaphorical ladders or symbolic ascensions, but actual physical ladders made of wood and metal. The timing was remarkable. None of these events had been scheduled or anticipated. They arose spontaneously from the fabric of ordinary life, as if reality itself had reorganized to accommodate what had been assumed in consciousness. What made these occurrences even more striking was the resistance many participants felt. They remembered clearly being told they would not climb a ladder. Some even made conscious efforts to avoid situations where ladder climbing might be required. Yet circumstances proved stronger than conscious intention. Emergencies arose that made climbing unavoidable. Opportunities presented themselves that made climbing irresistible. The feeling that had been impressed upon consciousness through imagination moved through the world of affairs with unstoppable force. One participant reported that she had actively avoided a maintenance project at her home, specifically because she remembered the instruction that she would not climb a ladder. But on the 3rd day after the experiment, a sudden storm damaged her roof, and emergency repairs could not wait for professional help. The ladder appeared almost magically, borrowed from a neighbor she had never met, and she found herself climbing it with a sense of inevitability that surprised her conscious mind. Another described how his office building's elevator malfunctioned, trapping him on the wrong floor during an important meeting. The only way to reach the conference room was through a maintenance access that required climbing a service ladder. As he ascended, he recalled the feeling of climbing that had been so vivid in his imagination just days before. The two experiences seemed to merge, as if the imagined climbing had been a rehearsal for this moment. The pattern held across every category of person and circumstance. Young and old, employed and unemployed, urban and rural dwellers all found themselves climbing ladders. The variety of situations was endless, but the underlying principle was constant. What had been assumed in consciousness with feeling had externalized as objective experience, despite every rational argument against such a possibility. This demonstration revealed the fundamental mechanics of how consciousness operates in relation to the physical world. The human imagination is not a passive faculty that merely rearranges existing images, but the creative power through which consciousness shapes experience. When a state is assumed with complete conviction, when it is felt as already accomplished fact, consciousness begins immediately to reorganize circumstances to match that assumption. The process operates through what can only be described as a law as reliable as any law of physics. Assumption, though false to the outer senses, hardens into fact when maintained with feeling. The key element is not the mental picture, but the feeling that accompanies it. Feeling is the secret that bridges the gap between the invisible realm of consciousness and the visible world of experience. When the participants felt themselves climbing in imagination, they were not merely engaging in wishful thinking or creative visualization. They were entering into the state of consciousness that naturally produces the experience of climbing. Consciousness is not confined within the physical body, but extends into the world of affairs, influencing and arranging circumstances to match whatever state is maintained with conviction. This understanding explains why the conscious instruction not to climb a ladder proved powerless against the prior assumption. The rational mind deals with words and concepts, but consciousness responds to states and feelings. The feeling of having climbed had been impi, rests so deeply that it became the dominant state, and consciousness expressed this state through corresponding external conditions. The ladder climbing was not caused by the imagination in the way that one physical event causes another. Rather, consciousness wearing the feeling of climbing naturally expressed itself as the experience of climbing. The interval between assumption and manifestation was simply the time required for consciousness to rearrange the seemingly solid world of facts to match its inner conviction. This principle operates continuously in every human life, though most remain unconscious of their role in the process. Every person walks through life assuming themselves to be this or that, and these assumptions, maintained with the natural feeling that accompanies complete conviction, inevitably outpicture as experienced circumstances. The ladder experiment simply made visible what is always occurring beneath the surface of awareness. The discovery that imagination commands reality through the medium of assumption places human experience in an entirely different light. It reveals that the outer world, seemingly so solid and independent, is actually the faithful reflection of inner states of consciousness. Change the inner state, maintain the new assumption with feeling, and the outer world must change to match. This knowledge connects every human being to a tradition of understanding that stretches back through the centuries to the very foundations of recorded wisdom. The ancient teachers who spoke of consciousness as the ground of being were not dealing in metaphysical speculation, but in practical psychology. They understood that the world appears different to each observer because each observer is consciousness individualized, and consciousness shapes experience according to its dominant assumptions. The mystical traditions of every culture have preserved this understanding in symbolic form. The ladder itself appears throughout sacred literature as a symbol of connection between different levels of reality. But these are not merely poetic metaphors. They are psychological descriptions of how consciousness moves from one state to another and how each state naturally expresses itself as corresponding external experience. The ancient teaching that the kingdom of heaven is within points to this same principle. The kingdom is not a place to be reached, but a state to be assumed. When consciousness takes on the feeling of the wish fulfilled, it automatically begins to express that fulfillment through the rearrangement of outer circumstances. The inner state creates the outer experience, not through magical intervention, but through the natural law governing the relationship between consciousness and its world. The Hebrew mystical understanding spoke of different worlds or levels of reality, but these were understood to be states of consciousness rather than geographical locations. Each state of consciousness has its own corresponding world of experience. Change the state and the world changes accordingly. The ladder experiment demonstrated this principle in action, showing how a shift in consciousness creates a corresponding shift in experienced reality. Even the great philosophical traditions recognize this fundamental relationship. The ancient understanding that mind shapes matter, that consciousness is primary and the physical world secondary, provides the theoretical foundation for what the ladder experiment proved practically. The participants discovered that they were not separate from the world they experienced, but the very consciousness through which that world existed. This realization transforms the entire human position in relation to life and circumstance. Instead of being victims of an external world over which they have no control, individuals discover themselves to be the very power through which their world comes into being. The ladder experiment proved that consciousness is not contained within the physical body, but extends into the world of affairs as the invisible cause of every visible effect. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond individual ladder climbing into every sphere of human activity. Those who grasp the creative power of assumption discover that they live in a world where consciousness engineers reality through feeling and conviction. Modern life provides countless examples of this principle in operation, though most remain blind to the underlying mechanics that govern these phenomena. Consider the vast industry built around influencing human consciousness. Every advertisement seeks to create a feeling. to help potential customers assume themselves into states where purchasing becomes inevitable. The most successful marketing does not merely present information, but creates experiences that allow people to feel themselves already possessing and enjoying the advertised product. When that feeling is successfully impressed, the purchase follows naturally, almost automatically. The medical establishment has documented what they call the placebo effect, where patients improve simply because they assume their condition is being treated effectively. This is not mere psychological comfort, but consciousness reshaping physical reality through assumption. When a person truly assumes themselves to be healing, their body responds to that conviction with measurable biological changes. The belief becomes the fact through the same principle demonstrated in the ladder experiment. Athletic performance provides another clear example of assumption in action. The most successful competitors understand that physical training alone is insufficient. They spend considerable time in mental rehearsal, not merely planning their movements, but feeling themselves performing perfectly. They assume the state of the champion before the championship, and this assumption shapes their performance when the external test arrives. The inner conviction expresses itself as outer accomplishment. Business success follows identical patterns. Those who achieve extraordinary results in commerce understand that they must first assume the consciousness of success before success appears in their affairs. They feel themselves to be prosperous or prosperity manifests. They take on the mental state that naturally produces the conditions they desire. Their assumptions about themselves and their capabilities create the very circumstances that validate those assumptions. The entertainment industry reveals this principle operating on a massive scale. Popular culture shapes consciousness by encouraging audiences to assume particular states and feelings. When millions of people simultaneously enter the same emotional state through shared entertainment experiences, that collective assumption influences the broader social environment. The stories told through mass media become the assumptions through which society creates its shared reality. Even the digital age demonstrates consciousness creating through assumption. Social media platforms succeed by helping users assume identities and feel themselves into desired states. The most engaging content does not merely inform, but helps people feel themselves to be intelligent, attractive, successful, or connected. These assumed states then influence how individuals interact with their world, creating experiences that match their digital assumptions. Yet despite overwhelming evidence that consciousness shapes experience through assumption, most people resist acknowledging their creative power. This resistance runs deeper than intellectual disagreement. It touches the very foundation of how individuals understand themselves and their relationship to the world around them. The primary obstacle to accepting this understanding is the comfort found in believing oneself to be a victim of circumstances rather than their creator. Victimhood, though painful, provides a strange security. It absolves responsibility for unwanted conditions while preserving hope that external forces might eventually provide salvation. To accept that consciousness creates through assumption means accepting complete responsibility for every aspect of experienced reality. This responsibility feels overwhelming to those accustomed to believing themselves powerless. If imagination truly commands matter, if assumption hardens into fact, then every current condition reflects past assumptions maintained with feeling. Poverty reflects assumptions of lack. Illness reflects assumptions of vulnerability. Loneliness reflects assumptions of separation. The implications challenge every excuse and justify no complaint. Fear of this responsibility leads to elaborate rationalization. Scientific materialism provides intellectual justification for rejecting consciousness as creative by insisting that matter is primary and mind merely its accidental byproduct. This worldview preserves the illusion of powerlessness while appearing sophisticated and rational. It allows individuals to maintain their sense of victimhood while feeling intellectually superior to those who claim creative power through consciousness. Another form of resistance appears in those who accept the principle intellectually but refuse to test it practically. They discuss imagination and assumption as interesting concepts while continuing to live from states of limitation and complaint. This allows them to appear spiritually advanced without accepting the discipline required to transform their actual experience through conscious assumption. Religious conditioning often creates resistance by teaching that human beings are fundamentally separate from creative power, which belongs exclusively to external deities. This separation theology contradicts the direct experience of consciousness creating through assumption, forcing believers to choose between religious orthodoxy and practical mysticism. Many choose orthodoxy, preferring familiar limitations to unknown possibilities. The scientific community resists this understanding because it challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which modern research methodology is built. If consciousness influences the phenomena being studied, then the observer cannot be separated from the observed. This threatens the entire structure of objective investigation and suggests that reality is far more fluid than scientific materialism can accommodate. Personal testing provides the only way through this resistance. No amount of theoretical discussion or external evidence can substitute for individual proof through practice. Those who genuinely test the creative power of assumption discover that their resistance dissolves in the face of undeniable results. The proof comes not through argument, but through transformation. The method for conscious creation through assumption follows principles that can be stated simply but require dedication to master. The process begins with identifying the state of consciousness that corresponds to the desired experience. Instead of focusing on external changes, attention turns inward to the feeling that would naturally accompany the fulfillment of every desire. To climb your own ladder, you must first become clear about the state you wish to assume. This clarity comes not through analyzing external circumstances, but through identifying the feeling that would characterize the consciousness of the person you want to be. What would it feel like to be healthy, prosperous, loved, creative, purposeful? The feeling, not the external form, contains the creative power. Once the desired state is identified, the practice involves entering that state through imagination and maintaining it with such conviction that it feels more real than present circumstances. This requires a reversal of ordinary consciousness, which judges by appearances and assumes that current conditions determine future possibilities. Conscious creation demands living from the end, feeling the wish fulfilled regardless of contradictory evidence from the senses. The key to effective assumption lies in the quality of feeling brought to the imagined state. Mere intellectual acceptance or wishful thinking produces no transformation. The assumption must be felt as an accomplished fact, with the same natural conviction that accompanies any certain knowledge. When you know something to be true, you do not struggle to believe it or wonder whether it might happen. You simply know, and this knowing shapes your entire approach to related circumstances. This knowing quality develops through practice and persistence. Like any skill, the ability to assume states consciousness improves with repetition and attention. The beginner may find it difficult to maintain conviction in the face of contradictory appearances, but continued practice strengthens the capacity to live from assumption rather than observation. The timing of manifestation varies according to the depth of assumption and the complexity of required changes. Simple assumptions may externalize quickly, while more comprehensive transformations may require sustained maintenance of the new state over longer periods. The key is to persist in the assumption regardless of the interval required for its externalization. Persistence does not mean strain or desperate effort. It means returning repeatedly to the feeling of the wish fulfilled, making it the dominant state of consciousness. When doubt arises, return to the assumption. When appearances contradict, return to the feeling. When others question, return to the inner knowing. The assumption gradually becomes natural, and the natural assumption inevitably externalizes